Two soldiers. Jungle so dark they cannot see each other's faces. A coiled wire stretching back through 300 meters of undergrowth toward the perimeter they left an hour ago. A radio handset that must not make a sound unless something is already coming. No orders to shoot. No permission to move. No one within shouting distance who can help. This is not the Vietnam War most people picture. No helicopters. No firefights. No dramatic last stand. Just two men lying in the dirt, forbidden to act, listening to a jungle that may already know they are there. That is a listening post, and it was worse than almost anything else in that war. When people think about the psychological damage done to soldiers in Vietnam, they think about ambushes, they think about booby traps, about the chaos of close-quarters jungle combat, about the unpredictability of an enemy that did not fight the way American military doctrine assumed an enemy would fight. Those things were real. Those things left marks on the men who survived them. But there is a category of damage that almost never appears in the documentaries, that rarely shows up in the memoirs, and that was never formally measured by the army while the war was still happening. It came from the nights when nothing happened at all. It came from the listening post. And once you understand what actually went on out there, you will never see those two figures in the jungle footage the same way again. To understand why LP duty was what it was, you first have to understand what it looked like from the outside, because from the outside it looked almost unremarkable. A small team, usually 2 to 4 soldiers, selected before nightfall, given a position outside the perimeter wire, sent out into the jungle with a radio, a field telephone, and a coiled wire connecting them back to the base. Their job was to listen. If they heard enemy movement approaching the perimeter, they called it in. If they were directly compromised, directly, meaning an enemy unit was on top of them, and there was no other option, they could fire to break contact and attempt to withdraw. Otherwise, they were to remain silent and still from the moment they reached their position until first light. No movement, no noise, no engagement unless survival demanded it. On paper, that reads like a difficult but manageable assignment. It reads like guard duty in a bad location, like a dangerous rotation that every soldier endured and most survived without incident. That is almost exactly the wrong way to think about it. And the reason most people think about it that way is because they are comparing it to the wrong thing. Guard duty, even in a combat zone, has structure. There are other soldiers nearby. There is a rotation. You stand your watch, you hand it off, you sleep. There is movement allowed within your post, communication between the men around you, the low ambient noise of a functioning unit that tells you, at a level below conscious thought, that you are not alone. Guard duty gives fear somewhere to go. You can turn your head, you can shift your weight, you can whisper to the man beside you, you can feel the presence of your unit at your back. None of that existed on a listening post. The LP team was cut off, not by enemy action, not by accident, but by design. The moment they reached their position in the jungle, and the darkness closed around them, they became invisible by necessity. They could not move without risking noise. They could not speak above a breath. They could not use the radio unless they had something specific to report. And they could not shoot without triggering a cascade of consequences that the mission was specifically designed to avoid. Because the moment they fired, the enemy knew where they were. The enemy knew the approach route had been detected. The value of the LP as a warning system, the entire reason it existed, collapsed the instant it announced itself. So the order held: stay silent, stay still, do not fire unless you have no other choice. And the men lay there in the dark, and they obeyed. This was not oversight. This was doctrine. The LP existed for one specific, coldly rational reason: to give the perimeter time. If a sapper team was moving through the jungle toward the wire, and the LP detected them, the LP radioed it in. The perimeter prepared, weapons readied, claymores armed, men pulled from sleep to their fighting positions. That was the exchange. The LP traded its concealment, and potentially its safety, for 60 seconds of warning. On a firebase that might otherwise absorb a ground assault with almost no notice at all, 60 seconds was the difference between catastrophe and survival. The math made sense. The math was brutal, but it made sense. To understand why it was necessary, You have to understand the specific problem Vietnam created for American defensive doctrine. The NVA and Viet Cong were not fighting the way the Army's playbook assumed an enemy would fight. They did not assemble invisible formations that artillery could track and radar could plot. They did not announce themselves with noise and movement that conventional perimeter defense could detect in time to respond. They moved at night, slowly, using the terrain and the triple canopy jungle cover to get within grenade range before a fire base or patrol base knew they were coming. Sappers, the enemy's specialized infiltration units, were trained to move with extraordinary patience and silence, sometimes spending hours crossing a distance that a walking man could cover in minutes. They could get close, very close. Close enough that the first warning of their presence might be a satchel charge landing inside the wire. Ground sensors existed by the late 1960s, seismic detectors, acoustic monitors, devices that could register movement and transmit a signal. They were useful. They were also blunt instruments in that environment. They could tell you something was moving. They could not tell you with confidence whether that something was a man or a deer, a patrol or a water buffalo that had wandered through the wrong stretch of jungle. In the conditions of Vietnam, the rain, the vegetation density, the animal life of the lowland jungle, sensor data required interpretation, and interpretation required time, and time was exactly what a ground assault was designed to eliminate. A human being in position, using his ears and his judgment, could make a call that no sensor of that era could make reliably. The LP was not the Army's preference. It was the Army's answer to a problem that technology had not yet solved. So the soldiers went out, every night, in almost every unit operating in contested terrain. And the first time a soldier went out on LP, the fear was immediate and total. He was leaving the wire. That sounds like a simple physical act, walking through a gap in the perimeter and into the jungle beyond it. What it felt like was something closer to stepping off the edge of a known world. Behind him were lights, noise, the presence of his unit, the accumulated small reassurances of other human beings awake and armed and nearby. In front of him was darkness that the jungle made absolute. Triple canopy cover blocked starlight. Overcast nights blocked everything else. Soldiers described moving to their LP position in darkness, so complete that they navigated by feel, one hand trailing the wire, feet testing each step, the man ahead of them visible only as a slightly darker shape against black. 300 meters of that, then they reached the position. They lay down, and the 6 hours began. 6 hours is a long time to be afraid, but LP duty did not produce ordinary fear, and that distinction matters. In a firefight, fear has an outlet. Your body does what fear was designed by evolution to make it do. It moves. It reacts. It engages the threat. The adrenaline that fear produces is consumed by action. The transaction completes. On a listening post, the transaction never completed. The soldier's body primed itself for action. Heart rate elevated, senses sharpened, muscles coiled, and then the mission required him to be completely, absolutely, continuously passive. He could not move. He could not speak. He could not shoot. He could not do anything except lie in the undergrowth and listen and make decisions inside his own head about what he was hearing and whether it was real enough to justify breaking the silence that kept him alive. The sounds were the specific instrument of the LP's psychological damage. Jungle at night is not quiet. It is a constant shifting environment of animal noise, vegetation movement, water, insects, the settling of the canopy after rain. A soldier hearing jungle for the first time at night, on a listening post, had no baseline. He had no reference for what safe sounded like, which meant he had no way to distinguish safe from dangerous. A branch moving in the undergrowth sounded like a man crawling. A small animal pushing through vegetation sounded like a patrol in approach. The wind in the high canopy produced something that, when a man had been lying still for 3 hours and his mind was running every sound through a threat filter, could sound like voices. His brain was doing exactly what it was supposed to do, pattern matching against threat inputs, flagging anomalies, demanding a response. And the mission said, no response. The mission said, lie still, assess, decide whether this is real enough to call in, and if it is not, continue lying still. That decision, made dozens of times across a single 6-hour watch, made in total darkness, Made alone or with one other man who was equally uncertain. Made with the full knowledge that a wrong call could reveal the position and potentially end both their lives. Was not a decision that anything in standard military training had prepared soldiers to make. Basic training taught reaction. LP required the opposite. It required the soldier to override every instinct his training had sharpened and his body was demanding, and to hold that override for hours. Veterans who talked about LP duty used specific language that recurred across accounts, across units, across different years of the war. They described it as suffocation, as burial, as a weight that sat on them for the entire watch and did not lift when they came back through the wire, because they knew they would go out again. The standing order not to fire, unless directly compromised, deserves particular attention, because it was the piece of LP doctrine that soldiers found hardest to carry, not in the abstract, but in the specific, physical, real-time experience of lying in the jungle and hearing something moving toward them. The logic was sound, and veterans understood the logic. A shot revealed the position, confirmed to the enemy that the approach had been detected, eliminated the LP's early warning value, and escalated a situation that might otherwise resolve without contact. If an enemy patrol was moving through the jungle on a route that would take it past the LP position but not directly through it, the correct response was to let it pass, track its direction, estimate its size, and radio the information to the perimeter. Do not engage. Do not reveal the position. Trust the wire. Trust the perimeter to do what the warning gives them time to do. That logic held at the level of mission planning. It held in a briefing room. It held in a tactical discussion between officers who understood why the LP existed and what it was worth. What it did not hold, what it could not fully hold, was in the body of a soldier lying in the undergrowth at 2 a.m, hearing footsteps that were close, that were getting closer, that were moving in a direction he could not yet determine with certainty. His training said fight. His body said move. His orders said lie still. The three-way conflict between instinct, training, and doctrine, playing out in total darkness over potentially minutes that felt like hours, was an experience that left a residue that no firefight left, because a firefight ended. That moment in the jungle could replay indefinitely. Most LP missions ended one of two ways. The team heard nothing significant, maintained their position through the night, and withdrew at first light, exhausted, wound tightly from hours of sustained maximum alertness, with nothing to show for the watch except the absence of an attack. Or something happened, movement detected, radio call made, and then either the perimeter responded effectively or it did not, and either the team got out or it did not. The clean middle outcome described in doctrine, team detects enemy movement, radio's warning, perimeter prepares, team withdraws on schedule, existed. It also required a specific combination of timing, position, enemy behavior, and communication that the chaotic conditions of the field did not reliably produce. The nothing happened outcome looked, from outside, like a successful mission. The log would show, LP deployed, LP returned, no contact. That entry looked identical to a night of genuine quiet and a night of 6 hours of sustained fear that produced no measurable event. The Army had no instrument to distinguish them, and because the Army measured outcomes in visible events, enemy contact, weapons captured, positions confirmed, the invisible cost of the nothing happened night went into no column. It was not counted, it was not addressed, it accumulated. Rotation made it worse. LP was not a single event in a soldier's tour. In units operating in heavily contested terrain, LP rotation could come around every few nights. Over a 12-month tour in Vietnam, a soldier in an active unit might complete 40 or 50 LP missions. Each one was 6 hours of maximum physiological arousal, with no outlet, enforced stillness in complete darkness, and the specific cognitive burden of that sound assessment decision made over and over again across the watch. The cumulative weight of that experience, repeated, unaddressed, and unrecognized as distinct from combat stress, was what LP veterans described when they talked about what the war had done to them. Not the firefights, not the ambushes, the listening. There was an additional dimension to LP duty that doctrine did not fully account for. Who got sent? Rotation in theory was fair. In practice, FNGs, the new replacements, the soldiers freshest in country, were often sent on LP disproportionately because veterans had already served their recent rotation and the mission had to be manned regardless. The logic was rotation-based and therefore defensible. The consequence was sending soldiers with the least experience and the least contextual knowledge into a position that demanded the most finely calibrated judgment available in the unit. A veteran who had spent months in the jungle could sometimes read a sound and make a reasonable assessment about its source. An FNG had no baseline. Every sound in the jungle was unknown. Every unknown was potentially lethal. Every 6 hours was 6 hours of maximum fear, with no context to reduce it, surrounded by a darkness that was not yet familiar, and an enemy that was. The position itself added another layer of difficulty that soldiers rarely discussed, because it sounded almost administrative compared to the fear, but that shaped the entire experience. LP teams moved to their positions just before dark. In triple canopy jungle, just before dark meant nearly no light at all. Enough to move, not enough to see the ground you were selecting. The spot where the team lay for 6 hours was chosen in the last minutes of visibility and occupied in darkness. They could not fully see what was around them. They did not know the exact terrain features within 20 meters of their position. They knew the general direction back to the wire, and they had the phone wire as a physical guide, and those were the navigational resources available to them for the entire watch and for any withdrawal they might need to execute under contact. That wire became something more than a communication device for many LP veterans. It was a physical connection to safety in an environment where no other connection existed. Veterans described checking it, feeling it between their fingers, confirming it was still there, not because they planned to use it, but because it was tangible in a situation where almost nothing else was. It ran back 300 meters to people who were awake and armed and able to respond. In the specific psychology of the LP position, alone, silent, dark, forbidden to act, the wire was the one thing a soldier could touch that confirmed the perimeter still existed. Some veterans described lying with one hand on it for hours, not for any tactical reason, just because it was something real. The Army during the Vietnam War had no clinical framework for what LP duty produced in the men who performed it repeatedly over a 12-month tour. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not yet a recognized diagnostic category in its current form. What soldiers reported: hypervigilance that persisted years after returning home, inability to sleep in full darkness without scanning the room, involuntary physical responses to sounds at night that pulled them back to a jungle position they had occupied in 1968. Was categorized under general combat-related trauma. But LP veterans consistently identified their LP experience as distinct from combat stress. The distinction they made was the same one that defines the mission itself. In combat, you could act. On LP, you could not. And the human nervous system does not process prolonged, enforced helplessness the same way it processes acute danger with an active response available. They leave different marks. What made LP damage particularly difficult to address, then and in the decades after, was that it left no visible event behind it. A firefight could be described, documented, located in time and place. It had a beginning and an end. It produced a report. LP damage came from nights when the report read, "No contact." Nothing happened. The soldier went out and came back, and the log showed a successful mission, and somewhere in that soldier's nervous system, something had been altered by 6 hours of maximum fear, with no outlet, and there was no entry in any Army document that corresponded to it. The damage was real. The accounting for it did not exist. Veterans who spoke about their LP experience decades later described specific, persistent symptoms that they traced directly to those watches. The inability to sit with their back to a door or window, the involuntary alerting response to unexpected sounds at night, the specific smell of wet vegetation that could return them completely to a position in the Central Highlands or the Mekong Delta. They described these not as flashbacks in the dramatic, cinematic sense, but as a rewiring, a permanent recalibration of their threat assessment system that the LP had performed and that had never fully been walked back. The jungle had taught them something, and the lesson had not unlearned itself. The men who were sent to command LP teams, typically junior NCOs, Sergeants who were themselves not far removed from their first weeks in country carried the additional burden of responsibility for the men under them. If the team was compromised, the team leader had to make the call. If the withdrawal was necessary, the team leader directed it in darkness, through unfamiliar terrain, under potential contact, while maintaining radio communication with the perimeter. The weight of that responsibility, on top of the weight of the mission itself, was something that Army doctrine acknowledged at the level of selecting experienced and reliable team leaders, and did not otherwise address. There was no training specifically designed to prepare a man for that decision in those conditions. There was the mission brief, there was the dark, there was the wire, and there was the watch. What the Army sent out on a listening post, when you look at it clearly, was not simply a small team with a radio and a mission. It was 2 to 4 men asked to absorb the full psychological pressure of the perimeter's vulnerability, to hold it in their bodies for 6 hours in the dark without releasing it through action, and then to bring it back through the wire and be ready to do it again in a few nights. The Army needed what those men could provide. There was no substitute available, and the Army had no mechanism to account for what providing it, night after night across a full tour, did to the people doing it. Across the years of the Vietnam War, in the after-action reviews and the tactical assessments and the lessons learned documents that the Army produced in enormous volume, the listening post appeared as a tactical tool. It was evaluated for effectiveness as a warning system. Its placement, its communication protocols, its relationship to perimeter defense, these were analyzed and refined. What was not analyzed, what was not studied, what produced no document at all, was the human experience of occupying one. The cost was invisible because the Army had no instrument pointed at it. The soldiers who paid it came home carrying something that had no name and no entry in any record. That invisibility mirrors, almost exactly, the experience of the mission itself. The LP was invisible by design. Its effectiveness depended on not being seen, not being heard, not being known. It existed, and it worked, and it left no trace. The men who served on it came home, and, many of them, did the same thing. They did not talk about it. The experience did not translate easily into language that civilians could receive, or that other veterans immediately recognized as combat experience, because it was not combat experience in the conventional sense. Nothing happened. They went out and they lay in the dark, and they listened, and they came back. On paper, on every piece of paper the Army generated, that was a successful mission. The listening post in Vietnam was a small thing. 2 to 4 men, a wire, a radio, the dark. It was one of hundreds of tactical tools deployed by an army fighting a war that resisted every framework brought to it. In the histories, it appears briefly, in footnotes, in tactical manuals, in the kind of military literature that documents procedure rather than experience. It does not appear, mostly, in the accounts that veterans gave of their time in Vietnam, because the accounts veterans gave were the ones that had events in them, the firefights, the ambushes, the helicopter extractions, the moments of decisive action that could be shaped into a narrative. The LP had no events, most nights. It had 6 hours of dark, and the decision made over and over in silence about what was real and what was not. The Army called it a listening post. 2 men in the jungle, a radio, a wire, and an order to be silent. Across 50 years, it looks almost administrative from the outside, a precaution, a rotation, a footnote in the tactical picture of a war already covered in footnotes. The men who went out there knew what it was. They knew what it took from them. And the silence they kept about it afterward, the same silence that most LP veterans maintained for decades, the same silence that kept LP duty out of the documentaries and the memoirs and the formal histories, was not so different from the silence the mission demanded of them on the nights they were out there. Absolute, enforced, and carrying everything inside it that was never allowed to come out. If this video gave you something to think about, something you had never considered about what that war actually asked of the men who fought it, hit the like button. It helps more people find this channel, and it tells me that this kind of story is worth telling. Subscribe if you want more videos like this one. The history of military service is full of experiences that never made it into the official record, the quiet ones, the ones that left no event in the log but left a permanent mark on the people who lived them. That is what this channel is for. New video every week. I will see you in the next one.